Jewel is fighting laryngitis, but you'd never know it.
You know she ain't ugly.
The authenticity and raw talent in her voice is evident in every note she sings.
Don't you cry.
Hello again.
Hey, good morning,
So
Jewel.
nice to see you. How are you today?
How are you feeling this morning?
Very good, thank you.
I had the opportunity to sit down with Jewel the morning after the Hollywood Bowl concert. Still smarting from a sore throat, she was gracious enough to talk about her fascinating life and career and her incredible outlook on life. What's your biggest vulnerability?
You know, it's interesting. When I was homeless, I realized I was very lonely. And I realized one of the reasons I was lonely is because I didn't tell the truth, except for in a notebook that nobody ever read. And I deserved to be lonely because nobody ever got the opportunity to know me, because I learned that being alone made me feel safe. Mm-hmm. But I realized when I was homeless that it actually disconnected me, and it separated me and isolated me to the point where I couldn't feel human connection or joy of connection. And I wanted to change that. And so I very purposefully switched my safety strategy from armor to vulnerability. And I started writing very honest songs, very revealing songs, and taking big risks about being very honest about who I was and saying the truth, that I was homeless, that I was shoplifting, that I was having panic attacks, that I was agoraphobic. And that's what my songs were about. And when I got signed, I decided to keep doing that, because I did notice that in fame, people tend to get put on a pedestal. Mm-hmm. And a lot of celebrities promote this image of perfection, of perfect beauty, of perfect happiness. And it isolates the artist, and it's not honest, because none of us are always happy or perfect. And then it also distances you from the viewer. They feel like you're this perfect piece of royalty, and they can never be like you, and it creates this gap. And I didn't want that. I didn't want a gap between me and my audience, because I was one of them. And so I tried to constantly take myself off of a pedestal and lead with the truth and lead with my flaws. And I did that my whole career, and it ended up saving me. The vulnerability really isn't, that's where safety is to be vulnerable.
Well, much of what you've written, both in your music and in your poetry, is confessional. Mm. What at core are you confessing?
I wanted to document an honest life. When I was a young girl growing up in Alaska, I didn't have access to much television, but I had access to books. And I really appreciated the writers that were honest, that didn't use art as propaganda to make themselves seem more perfect than they were. Right. And so I was drawn to artists like Bukowski and Anais Nin, not because I wanted to be them or live their lifestyles, but because I really appreciated the courage that it took to say their flaws along with their talents. And that made me feel more hopeful as a young child that maybe there wasn't something wrong with me. Because when you look through those magazines and you see pretty perfect people, you just feel alienated. Mm-hmm. And so I made a promise when I was quite young to write honestly and to never use my art as propaganda. And I try to stay true to that my whole career.
Now back to the question. What are you confessing? What's your biggest confession as a person?
Yeah. It's changed over the years, depending on what I'm working on. In the beginning, it was really just how lonely and afraid I was. Talking about panic attacks, that I was stealing, things that felt very shameful to me at the time. Now those don't really carry any shame for me, but at the time they were big confessions. In my book, I talk about cycles of abuse and how we have these emotional inheritances that get passed on generationally. And until we learn a new emotional language, we will speak the language we were raised with. And my dad very courageously allowed me to talk about some pretty hard stuff in my book. Not only about the abuse he was raised in, but how he then became an abusive father, much to his horror. But he didn't get to learn a new emotional language. And he had a lot of PTSD, and he turned to alcohol when my mom left to try and calm his anxiety, and then he started repeating the pattern he was raised with. And then the shame cycle kicks in for him. Right. And that's why I moved out when I was so young. My dad amazingly changed in his 50s and taught himself a new emotional language.
Not an easy thing to do.
It's heroic. I think that's one of the most heroic things a person can do, is to change, to be willing to take the work and rewire their brain. It's what I wanted to do, and I did that in my early 20s and continue to do it. But to see my dad do it in his 50s and 60s was very touching. I forgave my dad the day I left home, because forgiveness is so important Carrying anger and resentment is like burning your own house down to get rid of rats. It just harms yourself, and I didn't want to harm myself anymore.
According to Jewel, after many years of work to repair their relationship, she reconciled with her father. And since 2011, her family has been featured on a reality TV show called Alaska, The Last Frontier.
My family were Swiss immigrants. They were the last to leave Europe before the Second World War. They were living in Germany. They homesteaded in Alaska. And my dad, was born back in Switzerland during a trip they took back home. And then they moved back to Alaska, living off the land, no electricity, no grid. My grandfather went on to be a senator, actually, for the state and helped draft the Alaska Constitution, which is a pretty amazing immigrant story. And my dad went away to school to have me. Then I was just born while he was in school. And then we moved back to Alaska once he graduated, and I was in Alaska the rest of my life. My big break was at the end of being homeless. It was about a year of being homeless. I was singing in a coffee shop every Thursday night, just trying to save enough money for a deposit on an apartment, and I got discovered accidentally. A radio DJ had heard about this girl that had a following. Started with 2 people, and then by the end of the year, I had a decent following, and he put a bootleg on the radio, and I ended up in the top 10 countdown of a very big station called 91X in San Diego. And labels heard about that, and they started coming down, and limousines started showing up, and they had no idea I was homeless, and they'd be like, they'd take me to these dinners that cost more than I made in my entire life. And then they would say, "Where can we drop you off?" And I'd be like, "Here, this is nice. Like, this corner's good." And I had a bidding war. Every label tried to sign me. It was very, very surreal. I had no idea something like that could happen for me. And I was offered $1 million signing bonus as a homeless kid. But I had read a book about how the business works, and that's a loan, and you owe the loan back.
Right.
And I had realized that my happiness was in my authenticity and in my honesty, and that I probably wouldn't make records that would end up on the radio. I was a folk singer at the height of grunge. And so I turned down $1 million signing bonus, and I took a big back end so that if I ever sold a record, I would then earn money. And it saved me, because my record didn't sell for 2 years, and I would have been dropped for sure if I hadn't turned down that signing bonus. And so when I got discovered, my life's goal wasn't to be famous or rich, it was to be a happy person. And then my second job was to try and figure out how to be a musician. And I tried to stay true to that my whole career.
You have an extraordinary ability to connect with the audience. How do you do that?
It's different every night and with every show. Mostly I'm on stage alone, which is much harder in some ways, but allows me flexibility, so I don't have to write a set list, and so I can really feel for the audience, and I can get them in sometimes a little quicker. But you have preconceived notions that people come with that they're projecting on you, and you have to shock them out of that, usually with humor, being provocative in some way, using a biting sense of humor, just something to throw people off where they suddenly go, wait, I have to reevaluate who this person is in front of me, and then they have fresh eyes to see you and hear you with. And then you start picking songs that start moving everybody into one space and one groove. And when that happens, you can really then start to move with the audience. But that's my favorite part about my job. Singing is a tool, your vibrato, your tone of voice, your body language. I learned about that part of our brain that turns off to constant anything. So if there's a faucet running continually, our brain learns to say, okay, we can ignore that noise and we'll tune it out. And that can happen on stage. People tune it out. They're sitting there for 2 hours. And so you have to do things that constantly trick their mind into paying attention to you again. And so that's where changing your phrasing, suddenly saying a lyric instead of singing a lyric, stopping, doing something unexpected with your body,
Maybe
all those
holding
things.
a note longer than you would normally.
Yeah, all that. Changing a vibrato, telling a story, whatever it takes to keep people's brains constantly going, oh, I have to pay attention, oh, I have to pay attention. And then when you can open their hearts by being emotional and always connecting emotionally, then you'll get a really neat connection. And it's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing to be a part of. I've always thought of it as a real honor.